Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Vulnerability Hangover. I am your host, Nikki. I am thrilled to share an extraordinary experience today as we delve into the celestial realm with the reputable astrologer Patrick Watson. If you're familiar with astrology, you know that Patrick Watson is a luminary in his field, renowned for his deep insights and precise readings. Today is a special episode because Patrick is graciously taking the time to unravel the mysteries of my own natal chart. It's a journey into exploring how the alignment of stars and planets at the moment of my birth influences the sequence of events in my life. In this enlightening conversation, we look at the intricate pathways of my natal chart, unraveling the cosmic secrets that shape my experiences. From relationships to career choices, Patrick skillfully navigates the astrological map, uncovering hidden patterns and shedding light on the influences that have sculpted my journey thus far. One exciting aspect we explore is the coincidence of my birth under a Venus retrograde. This isn't just any retrograde. It happened to coincide with one of the world's most talked about sex scandals. The synchronicity is uncanny, and Patrick and I dive deep into this unique planetary alignment. So if you ever wondered how the stars might influence your own path, or if you're simply curious about the cosmic forces in my chart, you're in for a treat. Please remember to hit that subscribe or follow button, rate and review. This helps my podcast reach those interested in our topics. Now, let's dive into my birth chart with the incredible Patrick Watson. Enjoy! Hey guys, real quick before we jump into this podcast episode, I want to let you know that the video version is available on my YouTube channel. If you want to see my full chart, go watch it on there. But if not, keep streaming. I appreciate you. And now back into the episode.
Nikki, I just want to say, for the record, since we're now recording, thank you so much for setting up this session with me today. And I know that these sessions can sometimes get into private matters of your life. So I just want to give you the reassurance that anything we talk about today, I won't be sharing with other people. I know that in this particular case, this actually will be shared with other people, but obviously with your consent and your desire. So happy to oblige with that. So you mentioned in the notes for this session that you wanted to understand a bit more about your chart, and you also wanted to understand what your chart indicates for the topics of relationships, especially. Mm-hmm. So was there a particular place you wanted to start, or you just wanted me to take you through my approach to understanding your chart?
Yeah, absolutely. Whatever way is your preferred way, I want to know everything because I'm still very amateur when it comes to astrology. So
sure, yeah, no worries. One of the really basic things that you can do in interpreting someone's chart and understanding a bit about who they are is by looking at a really basic fact, which is whether or not you were born during the day or at night. And so we can see you were born very clearly during the day. And so we know that's going to make certain planets more beneficial for you and other ones less beneficial. Mm-hmm. And it also tells us that the sun is going to probably be like the primary light in your chart as opposed to the moon, given that it was above the horizon at the time you were born. So in terms of interpretation, this tells us just in general that you might be someone who makes things happen more than they let them happen to themselves, that you might be more of a person who is like more proactive as opposed to reactive. That's the kind of thing we might be able to very generally say about like a solar or diurnal birth, daytime birth. But we can get a lot more specific, obviously, with the rising sign. The rising sign is that place in the sky where we see the planets and suns and stars emerge. And so it's supposed to represent something about your own kind of emergence into the world. And so the sign of Gemini was rising at 12:07 p.m. in your birthplace. And that is the sign of Gemini, which is ruled by Mercury. And so Mercury is the planet then that represents who you are in a sense. And so we'd have to interpret the position of Mercury in order to get a sense of like what function you play in the world, what your kind of modus operandi is, some of your sort of prime motivations and characteristic ways of acting or behaving. And so Mercury is the planet associated with the intellect, with language, with translation, interpretation, analysis, speech. So it makes sense for people who have a really strong inclination towards like having strengths in these areas, or otherwise having to do a lot of mental work in these areas, and being someone who is changeable, and being someone who in some ways can be more fluid, or whether that's between like speaking different languages and being able to coexist in different social contexts. Mercury is this fluid sort of character, so it can reflect people who have mellifluous or changeable quality about them. Now, if we look at your Mercury in particular, we can see that it is in the 9th house by sign, but right on the midheaven by degree. So at the time you were born, Mercury was like really close to the exact center of the sky, the exact dividing line between north and south. So it tells us that not only maybe on a character level, you might be someone who maybe is more like talkative and analytical and intellectual, but that you would do this in a very pronounced way, and even in a professional way, and that your words would reach wide audiences and reach far away because it's in the 9th whole sign house, as well as being on the point associated with like reputation, profession, career. So those topics get mixed together. So I realized I gotta remember to try to speak in plain English when I'm analyzing these things. But what I would think your chart is really supports is the idea of you being someone who is just by nature like curious person who floats between different lives or different careers, or has something about them which is bifurcated in these two domains of experience, and that you would have as a special skill or as a special quality about yourself would be that you have like a pronounced gift of like conversation, or being able to word things well, to speak convincingly, or to speak enthrallingly, and to be able to do this in a way that can even function as a sort of professional thing that you do. So this would be good for like a writer, or good for working in like advertising, or well, podcasting even might make sense for this, right? That's speech. That's with a microphone, obviously. And given that it's even in the 9th house of religion and spirituality, politics, culture, higher minded things, or learning, it would give us the impression of you being a sort of traveler, explorer. Sometimes literally, this can make sense for someone who maybe travels widely, but it can also make sense for someone who just explores the domains of knowledge in a very kind of curious and flitting way. So I would think maybe like for a young child to have a child like this, I would think maybe they did well in school, or perhaps given that Uranus is there as well, maybe being someone who has a real sort of independent streak and maybe would have trouble with like listening. That this would be like a very excitable person who would be maybe more motivated by their own desire to learn and their own kind of curiosity rather than just following the rules. Because Mercury has a cheekiness and a naughtiness to them as well. There can be people who kind of figure out loopholes to things, can sometimes be the dissenters, or the people who are contrarian. So I might wonder, with Mercury ruling your ascendant, if that would also at certain points make you someone who likes taking the contrarian point of view, being a devil's advocate, or in various ways, mentally or intellectually inhabiting the place of the other and exploring what that's like. So I don't know if any of this is making sense to you, or if that resonates with you. But any astrologer using this technique would understand Mercury as being that kind of primary planet representing you, and would think of you as having some of these qualities of Mercury, both in terms of sort of strengths and skills and qualities, good and bad, and that the kind of areas where you might have a really strong area of focus in is learning, travel, speech, especially in a professional dimension, as well as a sort of spiritual or political or conviction-based dimension as well. So I'd be curious what you have to say about that. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, that's
Oh
so
no.
funny that you mentioned like, oh, the cheekiness of like, oh, we're like mischievous. I always am like thinking of like different things at the time, like, oh, should I have reacted to this in this way, or should I have spoke about this in this sort of way? I'm like, and I always say I'm like the queen of duality. I have to play devil's advocate because I don't think there's just one way of doing things or saying things. And so that is so accurate for me.
That's interesting. And because it's in the ninth place, like, have you had many experiences in foreign places? Have you learned other languages? Is that something you've explored or not really?
I was trying to do like Duolingo to learn Spanish, and then I somehow leaned into learning French. So that's something that I just did for a little bit. I do want to travel here pretty soon. I was supposed to start traveling the whole US and Canada and possibly Mexico area next year, but I think that might be put on hold just because I have my surgery coming up and everything, and
Right.
my whole life's like at a standstill right now. But yeah, I would love to travel a lot more.
Hmm. And the ninth house also pertains to like places of higher education.
Hmm.
So it pertains to like learning. And so I'd be curious, what has your experience been with like your education? Is that something that has gone smoothly, or is that something that has been a little disturbed or not straightforward? What's your experience in that part of life in education?
I was on a 504 plan as a kid because I just had a really hard time like staying on top of things at school. And it wasn't necessarily that I wouldn't complete my task. It was like if I was learning something and I wasn't interested in it, I would not like put any effort in whatsoever. So I never went to college or anything like that, but I excelled in classes that were like college level when I was in high school. So I took like a forensic science class, and I used to be really into true crime just for like the sheer justice of when they catch the bad guy or whatever. And I really wanted to be doing that kind of stuff. So I excelled in that college level class,
Hmm.
but in my other classes that I wasn't really passionate about, I would fail. And my parents were like, oh, why can't you just put all the effort that you would in this class to this one? And it was always because I didn't want to do it.
Hmm. So you're someone who's really motivated by their own, you're going according to your speed,
Yeah.
right? And according to your interests rather
Hmm.
than the kind of regimented thing. And that's something I sometimes get tripped up when I look and I see a really strong Mercury for someone, is sometimes that can just elevate the degree to which someone operates intellectually. But I have to remember that there are different kinds of intelligence as well.
Hmm.
And it's not always gradable in the same way.
Right.
And so Mercury, when you have a really strong Mercury like yours, it can also just reflect someone who has a kind of inability to be pinned down, and someone who is just the same things that make someone kind of intellectual, good at mental abilities, also might make someone who has a hard time staying still. And it seems like you obviously have like a great degree of like curiosity, and that's how you seem to engage with these ninth house topics. It's not necessarily in the way that society, I guess, maybe conventionally measures that, but I think
Yeah.
it makes sense. And regardless of its connections to college and university, we also know that your Mercury is really pivotal in terms of the fact that you do something mercurial as a career. That's a really basic sort of interpretation. Someone might say that you would be someone whose words would reach wide, faraway audiences, or that
Hmm.
this is good for a publisher, good for a writer, good for a podcaster. This is something you still do to a high degree, even if it's not like, I don't know, there's even a degree program for podcasting. Oh, maybe there
Right.
is now, I don't know. But I think if I was gonna look at your chart and think like, what major would they have? Maybe communications would be, or literature perhaps.
Hmm.
um so that is a planet which really sticks out as like the focal one. And so all of the other planets in your chart are going to represent other people, other figures, other sort of potentials in other areas of your life.
Hmm.
And so the other house that Mercury has responsibility over is the fourth house of parents, which is interesting because it would suggest that there is something about what your parents did in their jobs that has somehow influenced what you now do. So sometimes that can make sense for someone who literally goes into the same industry that their parents went into, or it can just say something more general about the fact that one's parents were somehow a big influence in what you ended up wanting to do with your life, like either to emulate what they did or to deliberately turn against it or being pushed in a very particular direction by one's parents. What would you say the role of your parents has been in determining your kind of professional choices?
When I was younger, they really pushed me to try and like go to college, and I've never been a 9 to 5 girly. I'm starting to realize like I'm not good with like going and working for someone necessarily. Like I'm good if it's like something I'm passionate about, like I said, but I never wanted to just be working a 9 to 5 my entire life. I wanted to have a 9 to 5 to support my hobbies that then become my career, like this podcast. But I would say that my parents were always like super supportive after I turned 18 and they saw my independence. So when I got my real estate license, and I still do real estate, I'm just an assistant now, but they were super supportive with everything that I did in that. And then when I pivoted and started working, doing social media work and stuff, they were really supportive with that as well. And they just have always been super supportive of what I want to do with my life, but they still want me to have that stability when it comes to like what a 9 to 5 would give you, essentially.
Sure. It's actually really interesting that you do real estate because that's another one of the topics I probably would have potentially guessed at for you, because you have the ruler of the IC in the 10th and you have the ruler of the 4th in on the MC, which is partly why I was trying to ask like what role do the parents have here. But it also makes sense because the IC and the 4th house also represent parents or one's origin, so it's interesting, as well as houses and homes, things from the earth. So it makes sense that you might have a career which makes sense with topics of the 4th in terms of houses and homes. Being a real estate agent certainly makes sense for that.
Yeah.
And so I guess, well, we could go through the 12 houses. That might take a while, but since I know you wanted to, I want to make sure we have time for everything. I would want to probably move over to the 7th house, since I know you wanted to talk about matters of relationships. And so in astrology, when you want to understand what it indicates for matters of relationships, you typically look at the 7th house, which is the sign opposite to your natal ascendant. So that's like the setting place of the sky. That's where the stars and planets are meeting with the earth. So it's a place of union. And that's why the 7th has this connection to weddings and partners and partnerships. And it's opposite to ourself, the ascendant. So in your case, I would say it looks somewhat positive for relationships, because you have the descendant in the sign of Sagittarius, which is ruled by Jupiter. And Jupiter in your chart not only is the most favorable planet in your natal chart, but it's also in its most favorable sign, or one of its most favorable signs, which is Pisces. And the only kind of problem or issue in some ways for Jupiter is that it's conjunct the sun, which is blocking out the visibility of Jupiter. So Jupiter was in a situation where it's combust. So what does this mean? Well, I would think that it is saying that the people who you end up being in romantic relationships with would be people who maybe excel highly in their fields, because Jupiter is in such a high place in the sky, and because Jupiter is favorable. So it show being with someone who is successful or highly achieving in their own domain, in their own career. Because it's in the 10th house of bosses and authorities, it could also reflect being with someone who is involved in the same like professional domain as you. So sometimes this can make sense for being in a business partnership with the person that they're with, or that maybe they met them through work. At the most saucy angle, that could even represent like being with a boss. Obviously that can be complicated, but it tells us that the kind of function that partners would play in your life is almost like being like a benefactor, or being someone who can help you out or cheer you up, people who pump you up, cheerleaders. Sometimes we have people in our lives who test us, right? Have some to teach us through like a hard experience. But I would think, because it's Jupiter, that it would be someone who is able to impart some of the good things that Jupiter has to offer in terms of wisdom or broader perspective or inside knowledge. But like I said, one of the issues with Jupiter is that it is so closely conjunct the sun, which could reflect partners who have really big ambitions and may even be unrealistic in a sense, because they have such an unbounded sense of faith that everything's going to be okay. So I think almost the problems or issues with partnerships would almost be that, like, they're maybe very successful people, but are distracted by the size of their own goals. Basically, someone who is maybe distracted by their professional ambitions. This is also exacerbated by the fact that Jupiter is square to your natal Pluto in the 7th. So there might also be a way in which partners end up having a lot of undue influence or control over your life because of their success. Like, this is almost like, I'm not saying this is the exact situation I'd expect you to have, but it's almost like what it might be like to be with someone who was like a famous celebrity or something, where, okay, yeah, cool, you're with someone who's high status, but they're away a lot because they're on business. And because the career is so high stakes, it ends up putting a lot of pressure on you, or ends up having a bigger influence in your life, because there's like maybe certain things you can't do because it could get out in the press. Or being like a political spouse is it's not a very in some ways very lucky or fortunate, because you're with someone who's like really high achieving, but it also puts a lot of conditions on your life and the way you conduct yourself, because it just has such a, there's high stakes associated with how you behave yourself and for their own professional ambitions. You can't just, there would just be these sort of this greater possibility of being in situations with a partner who's the good things in their life have this undue influence on how you present yourself or something like that. In general, even if we weren't taking Jupiter into account, we can see you have the moon and Pluto in the 7th whole sign house here as well. And that's another way we might be able to say this can reflect being with people who at the very worst end might have a potential to be controlling individuals, or people who otherwise exert a lot of undue influence over you, controlling or manipulative partners. But I would say, because it's like square with Jupiter, it's more like don't screw this up. It's more along those lines, where it's like, because you have to, there's a lot of rules you might have to follow in order to have these good things that can come from the relationship. So granted, I've spoken a lot now, I've just talked my head off here. I'm curious, have you had like significant relationships in your life so far? You're still very young, but so far, have you had any significant relationships? And does this interpretation make any sense in some way? Like, are they people who are very career focused? Are they highly achieving people? What would you say in response to that? Does it make any sense or no?
Yeah, I would say for the most part, all of my partners have been really ambitious people, which comes to a fault because, like, it's almost like they're working all of the time, but they also have this side of them that is controlling over me. So, in a past relationship, I had been with someone who was very wealthy, and I ended up working with him, and it was just not a very healthy dynamic. But it's funny that you mentioned that I could be possibly with someone who is like in the spotlight or something like that. I've always had this feeling that I was going to be ending up with someone who is really big in either the influencer world or is an actor of some sort. So I really get hyper fixated on certain celebrities or certain influencers, and I picture myself with them, which is strange. But I'm
I
very
mean,
drawn.
dream big. You've
Yeah.
got the chart for it.
Right.
But like you've already noticed, like
Hmm.
there's a cost.
Hmm.
It's not because if like someone who maybe has achieved less or has like lesser ambitions or something, maybe they'd have more time for you.
Hmm.
But your chart seems to show kind of going big or going home,
Hmm.
like with partners who, and that's also interesting. You said you ended up working for one.
Hmm. Yeah.
So they did end up becoming your boss in a sense. You were with
Yeah.
your boss. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, at least you were together before you started working. Otherwise,
Yeah.
that could be a little problematic, but not
Yeah.
my business. I'm
Yeah.
just trying to read the chart. So that's quite interesting then. So you have had some experiences like that. Now, in terms of timing
Hmm.
for like when I would expect there to be significant events in your life pertaining to the topic of relationships, and this is the same really for any Gemini rising who's watching, that transits through the sign of Sagittarius should in theory be these more important developments, either
Hmm.
positive or negative depending on the type of transit, for events involving partnerships. So for example, um because Jupiter is the ruler of Sagittarius and because Sagittarius is your seventh house, I would think that the last time Jupiter went through Sagittarius probably would have been a time that you might have had some significant events happen concerning relationships, and probably on the good side. And that would have been basically um uh, like from mid 2018 through mid 2019. Let
Hmm.
me just double check the timing on that transit, but just using my own memory, I think Jupiter was in Sagittarius. Yeah, so it entered November 2018 and it spent about 12 months in that sign until November 2019 was when it finally left. So I'd be curious if you recall at that time, were you seeing anyone at that
Hmm.
particular time in that
Yeah,
year?
I was. Yeah.
Is that when you actually met them or
Yeah, I believe our first date was November 1st. So, yeah, it was November 1st.
of 2018? Okay, so November 1st, we can see Jupiter was at 28 degrees of Scorpio and Jupiter would have entered Sagittarius
Hmm.
on November 8th. So you you started dating this person 1 week before Jupiter actually entered the sign. And how long were you with that person? How long were you dating them?
Off and on for years, so up until 2022 of April.
2022 of April.
Hmm.
Now, what's really interesting about that is we know that Jupiter is the ruler of your natal seventh house, right? Jupiter is the planet in your chart that represents partnership. And we
Hmm.
know that Jupiter is in Pisces. So the next time that I'd be looking for a major important event concerning relationships would probably be when Jupiter reached Pisces. And in April 2022, where's Jupiter? It's in Pisces. Uh, so I would think that because Jupiter represents the topic of partnerships in your life, the cycle and timing of Jupiter would probably time out a lot of the relationship events of your life. So it's quite interesting to note that you started dating this person literally 1 week before Jupiter entered into Sagittarius. So that first year together
Hmm.
was Jupiter going through the first house when things were good. And then you get to the Jupiter return, which would have begun late 2021 or early 2022. And this seems to be when you have reached some sort of bookend in
Hmm.
the relationship. Now, did things end poorly?
Um, I think it was just due to like we just were not getting along and it was
Mhm.
the best thing to happen for both of us.
Yeah,
So I wouldn't say we don't talk or anything, but I don't think it was all that poor. It was like more so like it needed to happen.
yeah. So I wouldn't expect it to be absolutely terrible with Jupiter being the kind of main signifier there. One of the other things that I think was important to note about 2022 is that if I'm looking at this correctly. So the very last solar eclipse that you had in the sign of Sagittarius, which is your 7th house, that was on December 4th, 2021. Eclipse events often set the themes down for like the next 6 months up to a year, because that's usually when the next year happens. But in this case, it was the last solar eclipse to occur in the 7th house. So this happened just a few months basically before the breakup finally happened. So we can see how there's two things happening simultaneously there with the end of that relationship, that it was not just having Jupiter complete a quarter cycle, but also the completion of a series of solar and lunar eclipses that have been occurring in Gemini and Sagittarius through 2021, with the final one occurring December of 2021, just a few months before you broke up. If I was looking at your chart in that time, I would probably have told you that it would look like a make or break time for the topic of relationships, where either it was going to go to the next level in a sense, or come to some sort of conclusion, or pause or break or something like that. So it certainly fits. So I'd be curious, after that relationship ended, did you get into another relationship right away, or was there a time where you weren't seeing anyone, or when who was next, I guess is my question, or has there been anyone since then?
Yeah, I haven't been in a long-term relationship by any means. I've just been casually dating people, but the last time I was exclusive with someone was towards the end. It was like through the month of November of 2022. So I ended up dating this guy for like a couple of weeks that I had known for a really long time, and we just never ended up dating. But that was so short-lived. He ended
Yeah.
up like cheating on me with
Oh
his friend's
no.
wife. Yeah,
Oh
it
no,
just,
I'm
I think
sorry.
it was like a rebound situation, you know?
Gotcha. Yeah, that's so interesting, because that was the last month that Jupiter was in Pisces, and it
Hmm.
was also conjunct Neptune, and
Yeah.
sometimes Neptune is associated with fantasies or illusions.
Hmm.
So I think they might have been someone who maybe looked really good on paper, but then like the reality was maybe not so great. And it certainly sounds like they had their own issues to deal with.
For sure. For
So
sure.
what if past is prologue, then it would tell us that the next sort of major Jupiter event that would be relevant for the topic of partnerships in your chart would be when Jupiter enters Gemini. And that doesn't happen for a little bit. In fact, I would say that it'll be very interesting to see what happens to you in late May, early June of 2024, because we can see that not only will the Sun and Venus be making a conjunction in your first house, but we can see Jupiter will be entering into the first house as well in this time. And so having this kind of huge presence of planets around the first house would suggest there's something pretty cool should be going on with you at that point. But I would think, because we know Jupiter has this potential connection to this topic of relationships, because Jupiter will actually be making an aspect with your natal Jupiter, that what I would probably expect is that there would be someone who arrives in your life who ends up turning your head a bit,
Hmm.
and could end up facilitating a similar kind of experience as you had that started in 2019. And that could potentially go up to 6 years, depending on how long it is. It's tricky to say. There are other things I can look at with respect to timing relationships, but what I've noticed with other people who have Jupiter ruling the 7th house is that the relationships like on a 3-year, 6-year, 9-year, or 12-year timer, because that's the amount of time it takes for Jupiter to go through to the quarter point, to the opposite point, the next quarter point, and a full return at 12 years. So for you, this will be like the Jupiter opposition of the 2019 experience where you got together with that person from that time. The last time Jupiter was in Gemini was about 12 years prior to that, which was 2012. Now, at that point, you were only 14, but I'd be curious if at 14 in high school, was there like a high school sweetheart, high school crush or something? from that summer that you can recall? It would have been at the end of that school year.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, I was like a serial dater during that time. I went from when I was like 13 to 14, I dated this guy that was like a year younger than me. Then when I went into high school, there was another guy that I dated for like a year. And then after that, I dated another guy. And then I just like chronically cycled out guys like after a year, I guess. And then when I turned 18, like probably around the time like June of when I was 18, I broke up with this guy and was single for 3 years, but like seeing people off and on, but not in a relationship.
Oh, so yeah, we hadn't even gotten to some of the other things. So one of the one of the things I thought was interesting is you mentioned that you started dating at 13,
Hmm.
and that is interesting because if you look back at when you were age 13, you can see that the nodes are transiting here through Gemini and Sagittarius. We know that there would have been a series of eclipses that
Hmm.
occurred across Gemini and Sagittarius for about a year and a half, from 13 to 14, and that's literally the period you just pointed out as being when this sort of began. Now, a lot of people could say, well, there's a lot of people who maybe start dating at that age, but I don't know. I've talked with a lot of people and it's really varies. Some people are real late bloomers, so you can't always say that. And the so that timing makes sense. Now, obviously in like high school, probably not dating any celebrities, right? So I would imagine then that the the guys from high school then would still have had this position of maybe like popularity or something, or high status at the school,
Hmm.
right? Because Jupiter is still that planet representing topic of partners. So I would like, is that I would, I mean, it almost sounds like bragging, right? But I would think, or very flattering or something, but I would think that it would reflect to your partners, whoever they are, whatever context someone is living in, that if they have this kind of placement, it reflects that the partner is someone who is somehow high up in the chain,
Hmm.
high up in status in whatever sort of hierarchy they're a part of. So would you say that was true even for like the high school dating years?
Yeah, I would say so. I around that age, like I felt like I could have dated literally anyone that I wanted to if I
Mhm.
really was just like down for it. But
Yeah.
most of the guys that I dated were pretty like popular. Like a lot of
Mhm.
girls really liked them and wanted to date them and stuff. And I'm sure part of me was
Lucky
like,
you.
yeah, I'm sure part of me was like, oh, well, he's mine. Like, and that was really the only reason for liking them, probably. But yeah, I would say that a lot of these guys that
Yeah.
I dated were like very attractive.
Desired. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. The so in terms of looking at transits through the seventh house, we've seen Jupiter transiting through the seventh house as being relevant when you got involved with that person in 2019. We see even when you started dating, you had this series of eclipses occur in across the first and seventh. In the year that you, within a few months of the breakup of that relationship, you had eclipses happening in the first and seventh house. So the other really major transit that happened in Sagittarius that I would think would be really hard for relationships would have been 2015 through 2017. And I think
Mhm.
you just referred to that period of time without my prompting. 2015, we can see that Saturn would have entered your seventh house and would have been there for about 2.5 years. So through 2016 and a lot of 2017, I would have expected that time frame to be when it might have been a kind of an uncharacteristic period of your life where you didn't have very good luck with relationships, and where there was a higher sense of obligation or duty, or more boundaries or barriers around being with someone. Can you tell us a little bit about those years?
Yeah, that was like right when I graduated high school, and I wasn't living with my parents at the time. And I ended up moving in with a guy that I was seeing, but we were never exclusive. He was like a super nice guy. We're still friends to this day. Probably one of my best relationships so far, just because he was like such a good guy to be with on paper, but like there was
But
no real attraction. Um,
okay.
so that makes a lot of sense. Like I just wasn't super like gung-ho about him, and he was very out of the well, I wouldn't say he's out of the norm of the guys that I dated, but he wasn't like super popular.
He was the exception. He was
Yeah.
like the Saturn one, and was
Yeah.
and I don't mean to, and I obviously don't mean anything like personal by this, but was it someone? Sometimes Saturn going through this seventh house can show being with someone who maybe there can be a significant age difference. Was this person a bit older than you?
No, he was only a year older than me.
Okay. Were you like from different, like very different backgrounds or something? Was there kind of a what kept you apart? It was just attraction,
I think it was just like on an
a lack of.
we were better off friends, I think,
Mhm.
at the end of the day. He was like we were both really immature, but like I was wanting to like I don't know, become more like successful and stuff, and like I wanted to go to college and I had all these ambitions where he was like trying to gain footing. He had been working for his dad and his friend, and he didn't really know where he wanted to go with his life, but he was a
Mm.
really good guy. I don't have anything really bad to say about
Yeah,
him. It's just like we weren't compatible in a relationship.
yeah,
We never fought really, but
interesting. I also see in that time you would have had what looks to an astrologer like one of the hardest transits you could have, where you had both Mars and Saturn making these retrograde passages through the seventh house.
yeah.
So the spring through early summer of 2016, I would have anticipated that as being a time of a potential breakup because of the challenges that would seem to present to the relationship. Does that make sense at all? I mean, I know you just said like we had no fights, but I mean, this looks like a heightened time of divisions to be occurring in the relationship
Yeah,
in
I mean, around
2016.
that time, I was like, got kicked out of my parents' house. So that could be like a form of division in my life.
Sure.
But I don't think we broke up until like summer of 2017 or like winter of 2017.
So,
Maybe,
um,
or maybe it was 26. No, I would say it was 2017.
well, we know well, another thing to keep in mind though too is the actual specific degree of your descendant is at 25 Sag, which is much later in the sign.
Hmm.
So those earlier events we mentioned, Mars and Saturn going retrograde, those did happen in the seventh house, but they didn't happen close to that really sensitive degree.
Hmm.
Saturn would have concentrated on that particular degree of Sagittarius, 25 Sagittarius.
Hmm.
Um, well, let's see when that hit. So there was the first hit was in like February to March of 2017, and
Hmm.
then there would have been another in June of 2017, and then one final one in November of 2017. So throughout that whole year almost, you had
Hmm.
Saturn really concentrating on that particular area of that sign that is the most
Yeah.
sort of sensitive point of your seventh house. And so even without knowing the exact breakup date, most astrologers looking at this would be like, what is happening?
Yeah.
With relationships, this is like someone who's really, it would show that the other person would be like just really coming to grips with um having like a big reality check
Hmm.
basically, and really grappling with like, okay, what's possible
Yeah.
and what can no longer go on. Not everyone breaks up though during a Saturn transit through the seventh house. I managed to survive mine.
Yay.
I managed to survive mine, but it was really funny because the exact day that Saturn reached the degree of my descendant, my wife actually said, I want a divorce. And I'm like, oh my God, I
No.
literally called it to the day. But
Yeah.
we actually managed to get past that. Somehow things got better past that point
Yeah.
because it's like our old marriage had to end and our new marriage had to really begin.
Mm.
Like we had to go through that crucible. And so that often, so it was still a very Saturnian experience. I mean, we're still together, but a relationship can survive Saturn transit through the seventh house, but it means coming to grips with the realities and hard truths of things. And sometimes the better thing is to leave those be and to
Mhm.
go on and to go forward. But in other
For sure.
cases, it's just getting through it. So it's
Mhm.
hard to say that it's like definitive breakup transit. So that's another reason why you would definitely want to be paying attention to these sorts of things. Actually, like we can see, actually, not too long from now, we can see that the planet Mars, which is really the more problematic planet in your chart, will be entering into the 7th house. So I would think that if you're currently seeing anyone, that they might have a tendency to fly off the handle in this time frame, or be dealing with difficult issues happening in their lives that could cause problems for you. I don't know if you're currently seeing anyone, but I would think if you were with someone, that those are some of the things I might imagine you would see with Mars going through the 7th house. Now, there is a completely different way that we can look at the topic of partnerships in your life, and that's through using this really arcane technique called zodiacal releasing. This is from ancient Greece, and what it does is it divides your life up into these chapters in time, and it gives you a sense of the level of activity in your chart over your life for a given topic. So right now we're looking at zodiacal releasing from the Lot of Arrows, which should tell us about the ups and downs and the peaks and valleys, basically, of your romantic life.
Mm-hmm.
And so the peak periods should be when you reach the mutable signs in this sequence, because you have a lot of fortune in Pisces. So Pisces, Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, those are going to be your like really big periods. Whereas there's also going to be challenging ones too, because Mars is there as well. Capricorn, Aries, Cancer, Libra, those will also be pretty good, but also mixed because of Venus and Saturn testifying to those signs. And then the ones where it's less emphasized overall are going to be the fixed signs, because those are the ones which are in aversion to or cadent to the lot of fortune. So I realize I just giving you a bunch of information here, but basically what I'm trying to just explain for you and for anyone watching, that the signs we want to pay attention to really are the mutable ones: Pisces, Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius. So what this is telling us is that your peak period for the topic of relationships would have started October 21st, 2020, and it goes all the way through till August 19th, 2032. So you're actually currently in the time frame which would be considered the sort of absolute peak period for romantic relationships. And this is a 12-year period which is subdivided into these signs on level 2. So it tells us that the very first peak period you would have had would have been October 21st, 2020 through till October 16th, 2021, about 1 year. And then you would have gone into a more mixed period from October 16th, 2021 through till January 4th, 2024. So this is quite interesting, because this basically spans the period of time from just a few months before the breakup all the way through till the beginning of next year.
Mm-hmm.
So in this time, we can see that the last sort of major transition point that you would have reached, according to this technique, that would have been, I don't think it would have been necessarily that great, would have been March 28th through May 29th of this year. Earlier this year, I would think that there might have been someone you were seeing, and it might have seemed like it was going to go well, but then it maybe was more trouble than it was worth.
Yeah.
Starting in March.
Yeah, ironically, I'm still talking to that person, but I think that we just have gotten to a point where it's like we're not relationship. He's not ready for a relationship, or he doesn't want a relationship, and I think we're just better off friends.
Mm-hmm. And when did you start seeing that person?
It was either like, well, we didn't really see, we met on like Tinder, but I would say
Mm-hmm.
it was like around Mother's Day. I don't know if that's in that time frame, or my
Mother's Day
mom's
would be
birthday.
May 9th or May 10th of 2023.
Okay.
So you're saying you met, well, actually, I guess I can look that up really quick. So this is Mother's Day 2023 this year. So Mother's Day was May 14th, 2023. So I don't know if you can see this here, but the exact date of the loosing of the bond to your Venus
Mm-hmm.
was May 10th, 2023 through till May 16th, 2023. So
Interesting.
literally the very day that you would have met up then on Tinder happened at this loosing of the bond of Capricorn, which contains your Venus. Now, this is interesting because were you seeing anyone prior to that? Prior to
I'm
contacting that person?
No, I was just like dating people off
Okay.
and on, like through the dating apps, but they were very much like short-lived.
So, because I know you said April 2022 was when the 4-year relationship had ended,
Hmm.
right? And so that means like basically from it ended here. There was as you mentioned a few dates that happened in here,
Hmm.
and but it's in this transition period that you reach contact in this person. I guess what's interesting is I would have assumed that it would be more negative after this point, but it
Hmm.
seems like the day that you actually met them happened to be on the more positive day, on
Hmm.
the lower level. So, I mean, it's always a bit mixed in the cardinal signs because you have Venus
Hmm.
in a cardinal sign, but you also have Saturn. So you have these two planets cooperating together. Venus, on the one hand, is giving the benefits of romantic connection or attraction, whereas Saturn is introducing these concepts of duty or barriers or the hard work of relationships. So that is quite interesting. Now you're still talking with that person. Does that mean like are you still dating or did it?
We live in different states. I think that he's like seeing someone more serious. I think he's like not monogamous and he's seeing someone more serious. There's no real honest, in all honesty, there's no real relationship there between either of us. We just like chat here and there, and I saw
So
him.
Saturn's distance. Yeah, okay, gotcha. That is so interesting because those are the signs which are highlighting this relationship, this square relationship between these two planets. Venus attachment attraction versus Saturn distance in this case of just literal distance.
Hmm.
That's quite interesting. Now, according to this technique, it tells us that even though this overall 12-year period that you're in is like a high, the Aquarius period, which begins at the beginning of this year and lasts for 30 months, is actually a cadent period. And it's so it would make me think that there'll be a lot of detours and maybe experiences that don't really go anywhere. And like I wouldn't say don't do them
Hmm.
because it's part of your destiny to experience the relationships that you do. But as you can see from this technique, it is telling us that the more significant period of romantic activity would actually be June 22nd, 2026, through till June 17th, 2027. This is the peak period here.
Hmm.
Now, what's interesting is when we were looking at where Jupiter goes next, I mentioned that like June 2024 looks happening for you because you get that huge cavalcade of transits happening in Gemini, and we know you have this connection with Jupiter and relationships, and that could be significant. But we can also see that from the perspective of this technique, those same transits are happening in an overall kind of muted or down, less active period. So it's possible that transit doesn't speak as loudly as maybe we'd expect, or maybe it's someone that you're introduced to, but you don't actually end up in like a relationship with until sometime later,
Hmm.
perhaps even 2 years later,
Hmm.
when by the time you get to the Pisces period. I'd be curious to see how this has worked out for you before. Here, let me clear that. So it looks like when you were in a Scorpio period, this is from like age 8 to age 23
Hmm.
approximately. You were in a Pisces period, December 2nd, 2012 through November 27th, 2013. So this is when you were 14 going on 15, which is one of the years you mentioned as being important in as far as you mentioned you were like dating a lot between like 13 to 15.
Hmm.
So this technique is pointing more specifically towards the 14, 15 ages
Hmm.
as being a time frame of increased romantic or erotic activities. Obviously, you don't have to go into greater detail than you're willing to, but if I were guessing when like there might have been like a first sort of erotic experience or something like that. I might look at one of these sort of peak periods in the teen years and assume like one of those could be that sort of experience happening for the first time for someone. The next one that really shows up on here is the Gemini period. This next mutable sign. That's October 18th, 2015 through June 9th, 2017. So that interestingly coincides with the time frame where Saturn was transiting through Sagittarius, and you were with someone for quite a long time and even moved in with them, but it wasn't able to uh, go forward beyond a certain point. So it's interesting when you compare this technique to the general transits. Some of them match up and other ones are happening on their own. And then here, October 21st, well, actually, yes, October 21st, 2020 through October 16th, 2021. It's interesting because this technique points out this particular year as being the high point. And for you, this was happening in the middle of that 4-year relationship, right before the breakup happened. So I'd be curious, like, does that mean that year was just like the best year of that relationship? Or was it that maybe this was like the year you maybe had an eye for other people or more interested in other people beyond that relationship?
I would say it probably was the best because it was like the beginning of the relationship. We hadn't lived together or anything like that. Obviously, the pandemic hadn't happened yet, or it was starting to
Mm-hmm.
happen. But we were off and on during that time period. So we were not like necessarily exclusive until I believe it was 2019, like June of 2019. So during that time period, like he was seeing other people. I ended up talking to another person, but that was like later on. And it was in a time period where our relationship, we didn't know if we were like gonna stay together, if that makes sense. So like
Mm-hmm.
definitely I wouldn't say that I cheated or anything like
No,
that, but
yeah, right. And no judgments either
no,
way,
but there
but
were definitely conversations that probably would be inappropriate to someone who is in a relationship.
sure. Now, the actual peak period though began October 21st, 2020. So
Mm-hmm.
this is like 7 months or so after the pandemic had actually begun.
Mm-hmm.
So, was there anything that changed about your relationship due to the pandemic? Like, did you weren't staying together at that time, like at the same place, or were you staying together at that time?
Yeah, we were living together, but we were living in a place that was not the nicest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we were in limbo, like moving. We were in a transition period, I'll just say that.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And it was not the best time for us.
And okay, yeah, so I wonder how this makes sense as far as like the peak period. I guess we don't really know yet because you haven't really gone through the whole thing yet. All we know so far is that the it seems like the end of the 3-year relationship coincides almost with the beginning of this period, and now you've been more, I guess, freed up since then. You did have this kind of impressive matchup with this loosening the bond on level 4 when you're going to contact with this person, but they're really far away. And you're going into this like more less like slightly less active period for almost 2 years, 2024 through 2026. So I guess we won't really know what the real results are until almost until you've gone through this decade, because that's when we'll know you've gone through like 2 major angular periods in this time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other thing that really sticks out to me though about the time frame of the breakup is, so you said that was like April 2022. Okay, so the reason that kind of makes my ears perk up is we know that one of the other major transit patterns that's relevant for relationships is not just transit through the 7th house, and it's not just peak periods and zodiacal releasing, but it's also transit of Venus, right? The planet most related to love, beauty, romance, etc. So in your chart, we can tell you were born just after Venus would have stationed direct, I believe. Yeah, February 1998. You were born just after a Venus retrograde. And this is
Ooh.
the rarest retrograde. So you were born at this kind of crucial phase of Venus where it had been retrograde and was going to be moving forward beyond that time. Now, Venus goes on an 8-year cycle where it makes those same retrograde phases every 8 years. So at age 8, age 16, age 24, age 32, you have those same Venus retrogrades happen that is similar to the one you were born under. And so the last time Venus went retrograde in Capricorn was December 2021 through till January 2022. So this is curiously close to the month that you guys had your split. So and we also know that the last solar eclipse occurred in Sagittarius in December of 2021 as well. So we have these two major transits happening, one of them happening in the seventh house, the other actually pertaining to your natal Venus. Here, I'll take you there. December 2021. You can see Venus was stationing retrograde on the 21st of 2021, and then it would have stationed direct around February 2022 and would have reached the natal position of your Venus on like February 23rd. So I would think that there would have been some kind of complicated social situation in early 2022 that likely preceded the decision to break up. Like, I would think that this is like when the offenses happened. Is that correct?
Yeah, there was talk of engagement. And then previously, before that, we had a pregnancy termination, August. No, I would say it was September of 2021. And then, yeah, there was talk of engagement around like winter time. So, but it ended up not going through.
Yeah. Yes. I can see maybe why that would have been the case. Although it's tricky interpreting Venus retrogrades because sometimes the retrogrades are times when people are brought together, and engagements have happened under Venus retrogrades, and weddings sometimes happen under Venus retrogrades, but they also make sense for times where people have major breakups. So it's hard to tell exactly what will happen for every person who's born around this Venus phase. But I think the thing that really clinches the fact that it would be like an ending as opposed to a beginning is probably the fact that the solar eclipse happened in Sagittarius in your seventh house just prior to that Venus retrograde. So another thing that kind of sticks out to me about that is we know that the halfway points of those Venus cycles are 4 years long. So there's a Venus retrograde in Capricorn, then 4 years earlier, there was a Sun-Venus conjunction in that same place. So that also makes me think then if we looked back at January of 2018, that's where you get that same kind of Sun-Venus alignment, but happening pretty close to natal Venus. You said you started dating this person in late 2018 though, right?
Yeah, like started seeing them in November of 2018.
So were you involved with anyone else prior to that person in 2018?
Yeah, I was.
Like around that particular time? Was that a breakup or was that getting together?
I would say it was a breakup.
Okay, so this is not a good omen then for this particular Venus. So let me just get this straight. So in January 2018, do you actually remember that was when that breakup happened?
Yeah, it was. It was like around that time exactly.
So January 2018, you have a Sun-Venus alignment in Capricorn on your natal Venus, and you have a breakup. And then 4 years later, Venus goes retrograde in that same part of the zodiac, and there is an engagement on the table, but it doesn't turn out the way that you think, well, then that's another way of being able to look ahead and say 1, 2, 3, 4, in January of 2026, there will be another Sun-Venus alignment in this same part of the zodiac where it could potentially make another significant relationship event possible. Obviously, the past two examples have been breakups. This one I might not think is so bad because Jupiter is opposing Venus, so there is that potential offset, although Mars is also with Venus. So this is similar to, in some ways, to 2022. But it's also similar to 2014. Now, in 2014, you would have been 16. This is like right before you turned 16.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember your sweet 16?
Maybe. I want to say barely. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the time frame leading up to your 16th birthday, we can see there was another like Venus retrograde in this same part of the zodiac, except this one was aligned with Jupiter, very similar to the one that will occur in 2026, which is interesting because
I was in a
Astrological
relationship.
releasing. Oh, you were?
Yeah, I think I was in a relationship in that time period.
Now, was this relationship somehow improper or complicated in some
Yes.
respect? Like maybe.
Yes.
Okay, the reason I ask is because Venus retrograde has this connotation of being sometimes a little scandalous. I
Mhm.
mean, what's actually interesting about this is the Venus retrograde you were born under in early 1998. That was when the one of the biggest sex scandals ever came out, right? That was the Lewinsky
Yeah.
scandal with Bill Clinton. That came out in January 1998, right when Venus and the Sun were conjunct while Venus is retrograde. So you were born on the tail end of one of the most widely known, highest profile public sex scandals ever. And I'm not saying like that just taints your whole life or something. I'm just saying that it puts you, I would say, for people who are born close to those kind of major Venus phases, they're just more prone to have lives which have a greater connection to Venus cycles and participation in the archetypal significance of those cycles. So Venus like brings people together, sometimes in challenging or delicate or complicated ways. So it's not necessarily bad, but just maybe a little complicated. So I think that's quite interesting. I think that's
Mhm.
another sort of cycle at work in some ways with your chart. We have transits through the sign of Sagittarius, which seem to not really miss. I'm not sure exactly how well the Zodiacal releasing for Eros describes your romantic life. It's almost still too soon to say, or I'd have to really comb through it maybe with like precise dates to really see how or if it matches up. But it also seems like these Venus alignments in Capricorn especially would be significant. I would say another Venus cycle that would probably be very significant for you as well would be the Venus retrogrades which occur in Gemini, because those are happening right around your ascendant degree. Because there's only 5 places in the zodiac where Venus goes retrograde. It shifts
Mhm.
backwards slowly over time. So in each epoch, there's certain signs that really get hit hard by those Venus retrogrades. So for you, I would say the areas that are really going to get hit hard are like the Venus retrogrades in Capricorn, the Venus retrogrades in Gemini. Pardon me. I don't think the Venus retrogrades hit your Saturn anymore. Let's see. Venus goes. Oh yeah, so the Venus retrogrades in Aries now happen. They don't hit your Saturn exactly. They just happen in proximity. And
Okay.
eventually, over time, these Venus retrogrades will move backward over your planets in Pisces. So you will eventually start having Venus contacting these planets in Pisces. So, for example, if you get to 2049, assuming you live a long, normal life, Venus will eventually go far enough back in Pisces that it will like make a conjunction to your Mars and stuff. So those Venus retrogrades might end up becoming more important as time goes on. But the last major Sun, Venus, and Gemini event was in May of 2020. So this is just a few months after the pandemic began. Is this when you moved in?
No, I moved in January of
January.
2020. Yeah.
So in that, I would wonder what the significance then was for that time frame, like May to June of 2020, because not only would you have had the Venus retrograde occur in your first house, but it's also when you would have had a lunar eclipse occur in the seventh house on June 5th.
Mm-hmm.
I like if it didn't have any kind of context or anything, I would think that it would probably be when you might have been either like interested in someone else or someone else's, or like an old ex or something, an old flame is like trying to come back into your life. It would seem like it's prime getting a text from your ex type transit where someone else is trying to come in.
I would say around that time period, that was like when we were getting ready to move to that place that I mentioned was not like the best spot because we were like selling the place that we were at, but I was like hyper fixated on like his ex-girlfriend because it seemed like she would periodically pop up in.
It was his ex,
Yeah.
not yours.
Yeah, but I
Yeah.
don't think anything like scandalous went
Mhm,
on. I certainly wasn't seeing anyone. We were in like a
mhm.
pandemic. I just
Right.
started my real estate career, but I would say it was like just an interesting time for it was like a big transition period, I would say.
Well, for you and for the world too, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
for
that was
sure.
a wild time
Yeah,
in some ways. Some good, some obviously just awful, terrible.
for sure.
And that's actually really interesting too, because we can see that in that same year in 2020, we see that Jupiter and Pluto would have been making this conjunction right in your Venus in the eighth house, which is interesting because the eighth house often reflects like other people's property or other people's possessions
Hmm.
and being able to benefit from them, right? Because Venus is there. But then having Jupiter with Pluto there as well would seem to, I mean, basically what I'm saying is I think this I would think you might have had really maybe good luck with selling houses at that time, making a lot of money from
Yes.
the property of others.
Yes.
Would you say that stands out as like a banner year? Like you've done that was like maybe your best year so far?
Oh, it was for sure. I had closed the most units I ever had in the year of 2020. Also, the place that we were living at was quickly depreciating, and we luckily were able to sell it for like a good price. And he ended up netting more than what he purchased it for. And he had
Wow.
only purchased it like a year prior. So everyone benefited from that situation.
Wow.
Yeah, it was crazy because I felt I was making really good money, but at the same time, I was like not very good about saving my money either.
I mean, it's hard to save your money when everything costs so much, right?
Right.
But well, that's really interesting that you had that experience with Jupiter going through Capricorn for the last part of 2019 and most of 2020 at the same time that obviously all this like life-changing stuff is happening around in the culture and in society in general. This is good for you to know too that when Jupiter returns to that place, when Jupiter comes back to Capricorn, that might be another good year basically for sales or being able to benefit from the resources of others. I would also have high hopes for when Jupiter's in Cancer for your financial prospects, that those would be the years where you really are able to upgrade your lifestyle
Hmm.
and income. So the next time that happens is like 2026. So
Oh,
a lot of things seem to a lot of things seem to be popping off for you in 2026, it seems. Let me get a more precise time frame on Jupiter going into Cancer. So Jupiter going into Gemini is going to be all about expanding and well, since the first house is like image and self and identity, Jupiter going through the first house can be a good transit for things like self promotion and making. It can be good for like starting new health regimes, becoming healthier. Jupiter, there can sometimes be a tendency, or rather a sort of stereotype of Jupiter going through the first house, is it can be a time when people put on weight. But I've also seen it when people get swole too. So it's like Jupiter's expansion, whether that's like healthy and strong or otherwise. It's a time where you have excess and where you can indulge in a sense in excesses. Jupiter then moves into your second house, so then it's expanding money and finances. That actually starts June 2025. So that would seem to be a time frame when your financial situation would be primed to really take off, especially at like, you even get this like Venus Jupiter conjunction occurring in like August of 2025. That even happens pretty close in opposition to your Venus. So yeah, I would think you would be making a lot of money in this time frame. We can also see that the solar and lunar eclipses of this time frame will be happening across the 4th and 10th. So maybe from a sale of a home, or from maybe even purchasing a home. I know for myself, when Jupiter went through my second house, it's when I purchased my house. Largest purchase I've ever made. And then I sold it when Jupiter was opposing it in the 8th. So I made a lot of money from that, but I also did it at the highest rates possible. Right. So
yeah.
big financial obligations too.
Yeah.
More money, more problems.
Right.
So I don't know. I guess I started looking at your financial stuff. I didn't know why I did that. We were originally talking about relationship stuff, but I guess I like to talk a lot, as you see, and I'm not good at being concise. Is there anything in particular, or something else you would like me to look at, or do you have any questions at this point?
So in astrology, can you almost like narrow down what type of person I would be attracted to by looking at my chart, or is it just you're attracted to this particular type of person in this chart? Or yeah, I'm just curious to see like what
Yeah.
type of person I would.
So when I'm looking at a chart and I'm trying to analyze the ruler of the 7th house, the kind of information I think it gives you is what sort of role a person will play in your life, and some of their fundamental characteristics, and some of your characteristic experiences with relationship partners, and as well as if you'll have like generally good fortune with those people or bad fortune with those people. So in many ways you are very fortunate in that you have your most benefic planet representing the other person. But as we also mentioned, the fact that Jupiter is conjunct the sun so closely, so that it actually obscures the light of Jupiter, tells us a bit about how they may be a bit absorbed or preoccupied with their own sort of professional goals. So on the one hand, they can achieve highly, but maybe being a victim of their own success in a way. And so I think when you're interpreting the 7th house ruler, you're getting that kind of information. So I could say, I guess some people might even be able to look at the chart and say, well, like, okay, well, I have Sagittarius in the 7th house, so I probably should look for Sagittarians. And like, that may or may not be true. In general,
Not
I've
for me.
noticed in general, I've noticed that other things seem to be more important than just if their sun is in the 7th house. I mean, I do think you ideally want good synastry with a person that you're drawn to as a partner, but I've also seen people with very difficult synastry manage to make a life for themselves, and that the difficult synastry they have with each other's charts ends up being very descriptive and appropriate for their particular dynamics. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I've always find myself like very drawn to like Scorpios, Capricorns, and Aries in specific.
Well, Capricorns make sense for you, right? Because you're
Yeah.
Venus in Capricorn. Um, Now Aries is a little more interesting, just in terms of sun placement, just because that is close to your natal Saturn. But
Hmm.
then that would make me think that like the Capricorns are like the guys you would have like a lot of fun with because of Venus being there.
Hmm.
Saturn, the Aries guys would probably be the people who maybe provide the greatest sense of like stability or structure or something because it's like close to your Saturn.
Hmm.
Whereas the Scorpios, that's a real mystery because
Yeah.
I mean they're trying your. I mean they are, Scorpio does like trying your Pisces placements, but Scorpio as a general house in your chart is the sixth,
Hmm.
which tends to be it tends to make sense with people who we end up being having to manage as opposed to being with on a more equal basis.
Interesting.
Um, so I don't know if that's the
Yeah.
case
I've
for
liked,
your Scorpio guys.
yeah. I mean, I have liked Sagittarius man. I'm thinking of like one in particular that's like an influencer that I'm like super attracted to. So maybe
Mm-hmm.
it's him. But yeah, I
But where's their moons? Where are their moons and where are their ascendants? You know, that would be the other kind of. If you, I mean, I would want to. Ideally, I'd want to see the whole charts, but
right.
in terms of just sun placements, that's one data point. They have other planets that might be more important.
Hmm. Yeah. So Capricorn placements probably.
Well, I would say Sagittarius as well because you have your moon in Sagittarius,
Hmm.
and because Sagittarius is the seventh. But I also wouldn't. Another thing I would expect is not just sign placements, but I would think people with certain aspects might show up for you. For example, given that you are a Gemini rising, and we've talked a lot about how Jupiter rules your seventh house, I would probably think then that the guys you're drawn to might have Jupiter as a sort of um in a more pronounced role in the chart. Maybe
Hmm.
someone with like Jupiter rising or Sun conjunct Jupiter like yourself, or Moon conjunct Jupiter, or Jupiter conjunct your natal Jupiter, or Jupiter on your Sun, or something like that, where they end up hooking into that feature of your chart that describes who they are. Given your Venus connections, I might also wonder about so being attracted to someone who was born at a similar phase of Venus, someone else who was born after a Venus retrograde. You sometimes see those kinds of connections between charts that maybe they were born at the same kind of Venus phase or same kind of Venus sign and phase. So Sun in Aries, Sun in Cap, Sun in Scorp.
It's mostly like Sun and Scorpio. I have been with a triple Scorpio, which well, don't even get me started on that. Uh,
Oh dear.
but I do find myself like somehow with people with Scorpio Venuses, which is also very difficult to be with, I've noticed too.
My wife would probably say that as well about me. I have a Scorpio Venus. Basically, the point is just that sometimes astrology can tell you about certain fundamental attributes or certain kinds of experiences you might have involving partners and partnerships. I think the way it shows it most clearly for you, Nikki, is the fact that um, because of Jupiter's dignified status in Pisces, it's reflected being with people who are like in a high position in their relative hierarchy.
Mhm.
So even in high school, it was like the popular guys, right?
Yeah.
And even now, as an adult, it's people who have reached sort of high positions in their own work. And then we also know that because Jupiter is in the 10th house, that it would reflect someone who either is involved in your work, that being with someone might even give you professional opportunities, or being with a boss, and then that actually ended up happening
Hmm.
for you. So there's a lot of ways that these symbols can work themselves out, but those are some of the kind of more common ones that I would expect with your kind of placement. And how you can do this in your own chart is to check out the ruler of the seventh house and look at the house that it's in. That can sometimes tell you something about the setting in which you discover partnerships, or a particular area of your life that you end up sharing more with that person. I've seen so many examples of that over the years. It's really interesting. And you can do the same thing looking at all the other placements of your chart as well, all the other houses. You can see, you start to be able to delineate how many different parts of your life turn out. And like I showed with the transits, when you know that information, you can apply that then in real time to, well, when are these planets coming back? When are they going to do their thing? And we've been able to see that a bit in tracing like Jupiter and its cycles, and Venus and its cycles with your natal chart. So that's how I do it. That's how it can be done. I hope this has been good for you. And this sort of explains a bit about your chart.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I learned quite a bit. Now I really do in the future want to be like taking classes with you too. I know Kirsten mentioned she might have done some, but yeah, I'm very interested in astrology as well. So, and I know
do
my
offer
audience is
tutoring.
too. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I do offer tutoring. The only class that I have open right now is I have a birth time rectification course that I released with Chris Brennan of the Astrology podcast.
Yeah.
That's available at the Astrology School. So it's a course we put together to help people figure out their birth times if they don't know what their birth time is. So we put together some techniques that we think can help people figure that out for themselves. But but otherwise, the only offering I currently have to where people can just talk and learn about astrology is through my one-on-one tutoring service on my website, patrickwatsonAstrology.com.
Heck yeah. Let people know like where everyone can find you and how they can book with you and stuff.
Thanks. It's patrickwatsonAstrology.com. Someone took my old domain, patrickwatsonAstrologer.com. So make sure you put patrickwatsonAstrology.com in, and that's where you can find all of like my old articles, and that's where you can find all the information about my services, general natal consultations, elections for finding the best time to do things, horary for questions, rectification for finding out birth times, and tutoring services if you just want to learn about astrology through a one-on-one tutor, basically. And you can also find me on social media. Most social media sites I can be found at pwatsonastro. So yeah, that's where you can find me.
Sweet. We'll link everything in the show notes for you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I really appreciate you doing this for me. And I guess we'll talk in 2026, if not sooner.
Right.
And I'll update you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, it definitely helps to keep track of your events. So make sure you have a diary or something you can keep
for sure
notes on when these things happen.
Yeah, I will for sure. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah. All right. Have a good one.
You too.
Thank you. Bye. Once again, thank you so much, Patrick, for diving into my birth chart. I greatly appreciate your knowledge and expertise, and I hope that my followers learned a lot from my natal chart as well. If you guys are interested in learning more about him, I will link all of his information in the show notes below. But that's it for this episode. Please don't forget to rate, review, subscribe wherever you listen. It greatly helps my podcast. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I hope you have an amazing rest of your November 11th, 11/11. Manifest all the beautiful stuff in the world. You deserve it. Okay, love you. Bye.